Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by IB.com. We are dealing with the rise of Joseph Stalin as a part of our Paper 2 exploration on authoritarian states. And he has managed to now establish himself, as far as our exploration is concerned, he has established to manage himself as the most important person during the time of Lenin. What happens when Lenin passes away in 1924? Let's explore the story further. So Stalin's bid for power, in fact, Stalin started as early as Lenin's funeral itself. During the funeral itself, he started showing that he is the person who's absolutely ready to bid for power in that sense. Immediately after Lenin's death, the Politburo publicly proclaimed that their intention to continue was in fact as a collective leadership, that they will now be 20 people in charge or 15 people in charge or whatever was the strength of the Politburo at that point of time. They claimed that they shall now rule the Soviet Union as a collective. Now that Lenin was dead, they shall all rule the Soviet Union together in their collective wisdom and as a part of the collective leadership. But behind the scenes, the competition for individual authority had in fact already begun. In the maneuvering, Stalin gained an advantage by being one who delivered the oration at Lenin's funeral. The sight of Stalin as the leading mourner suggested a continuity between him and Lenin, an impression that heightened by the contents of his speech, in which, in the name of the party, he dedicated himself to following in the tradition of the departed leader. So he gave such an oration, which in fact made him come out as the most loyal servant, or not the servant, but the most loyal follower of Vladimir Lenin. So that is something that was very, very crucially a point of the way Stalin started the maneuvering. Some of you might already know that Stalin's initial training as a child was in a seminary. His mother wanted him to be a priest, and that is something that he really uses in this particular funeral speech as well. He delivers the speech in the form of catechisms, as is done in the Catholic Church or in the Orthodox Church, and he made the entire gathering there repeat after him certain lines that would make sure that everybody vividly remembered the way Stalin led this entire funeral and was in fact the chief mourner, thus showing a continuity as well. So here is an excerpt from Stalin's speech, which has been in fact published as a part of Robert Service's excellent biography of Stalin. Robert Service has also written a biography of both Lenin and Trotsky apart from Stalin as well. Highly suggested reads for anybody who's interested in exploring these three lives. So he says, "In leaving us, Comrade Stalin commanded us to keep the unity of our party. We swear to thee, Comrade Stalin, to honor thy command." So can you see the language? It's already very religious, that we swear to thee that we shall follow thy command. In leaving us, Comrade Lenin ordered us to maintain and strengthen the dictatorship of the proletariat. We swear to thee, Comrade Lenin, to exert our full strength in honoring thy command. In leaving us, Comrade Lenin ordered us to strengthen with all our might the union of workers and peasants. We swear to thee, Comrade Lenin, to honor thy command. It's almost being done like a religious procession. The wordings, the repetitions, the catechisms, it's almost being done like a religious ceremony, and that is Stalin's genius for you. Alright, to lead this in a way in which it makes sense to him and to the ordinary people who are attending that ceremony. That is his genius in being the chief mourner and carrying it out in this way. Since Stalin's speech was the first crucial move to promote himself as Lenin's successor, it was to be expected that Leon Trotsky, his chief rival, would try to counter it in some way. Trotsky was a prominent figure in the party. He had played a key role in the 1917 October Revolution and had in fact been the brilliant organizer of the Red Army that protected the Bolsheviks in their first few years, in fact fought against the so-called White Army as well, and really helped the Bolshevik party survive in the Soviet Union. And he had also won the civil war against the Whites. Yet, Trotsky was not even present at the funeral. His excuse was that Stalin had given him the wrong date. Whatever the truth of this, Trotsky's behavior hardly appeared to be that of a dedicated Leninist. So at this point of time, the idea is not so much who will be the great Stalinist, the idea is who will be the best Leninist. And in that fight, definitely the first round goes to Joseph Stalin. Suppression of Lenin's testament. So that's the second key aspect in terms of Stalin's maneuvering for power immediately after the death of Lenin. Although Stalin had been totally loyal to Lenin, so much so that he changes his name. I'm sure most of you are already aware of the fact that his actual name is not Stalin. His actual name is Vissarionovich Zhugashvili, Joseph Vissarionovich Zhugashvili. He changes his entire name so that it can rhyme with that of Lenin. And Stalin, of course, means the man of steel. Not Superman, but definitely the man of steel. So in that sense, he had been totally loyal to Lenin, going to the extent of changing his name so that it can rhyme with Lenin's name. There had been times when he had in fact offended his leader. One such occasion had in fact occurred in 1922 when Lenin learned from his wife, Krupskaya, that Stalin had in fact verbally abused her during a telephone conversation. In an angry response, Lenin added a severe criticism of Stalin to a document that he had been dictating. Later on known as Lenin's Testament, this was a set of observation on the strength and the weakness of party's leading members. Lenin had been specially critical of Stalin's hunger for boundless power because Lenin is observing, the kind of posts he's holding, the kind of positions he's wanting. So this boundless hunger for power is something that Lenin notes in that testament and urged the comrades to consider ways of removing him as the secretary. But of course, this was not done. Lenin was too ill during the last year of his life to be politically active. At his death in January 24, he had still not taken any formal steps to remove Stalin, and the testament had in fact not been made public. If it were now to be published, if it was to be published in 1924, immediately after Lenin's death, Stalin would be gravely damaged by its content. However, here again, fortune favored him. Since the testament contained Lenin's criticism not simply of Stalin but of all members of the Politburo, they all had a reason for, in fact, suppressing it, which they in fact formally did in May of 1924. So, in May of 1924, the Politburo as a whole decided that they are not going to publish the document publicly. Since Trotsky had been criticized in the testament for his excessive self-confidence, he also went along with the decision, but in doing so, he lost an opportunity to challenge Stalin. In fact, it was Trotsky, not Stalin, whom the Politburo regarded as the greater danger. So that is why everybody was in fact very clear that it is Trotsky who has to be suppressed and not Joseph Stalin. Stalin had the cleverness to show himself as the very naive leader who was just following everyone's opinions. Then finally comes Trotsky's opposition to Stalin. So Trotsky realizes at some point of time that if this continues, his own existence would be in danger, and that is why that begins his opposition, direct opposition to Stalin. Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, who had been leading players in the 1917 revolution, in fact joined Stalin in an unofficial triumvirate within the Politburo. So, an unofficial triumvirate simply means the trio shall vote together in the Politburo. So any important decision, you could rely on the fact that these three would always discuss it privately and would vote on it publicly together. Their aim, in fact, of coming together was not so much to have this kind of a faction within the Politburo. You would remember that factions are not allowed, but they are creating this faction in order to oppose Trotsky. They were very worried about Trotsky, even Zinoviev and Kamenev. What were Trotsky's handicaps then? Trotsky was a Jew and very conscious of the fact that it constituted a political handicap. Anti-Semitism was an ingrained feature of Russian society and in fact continued under communist rule. In 1917, he had declined Lenin's offer to be a commissar on the grounds that his appointment would be an embarrassment to Lenin and the government. He said it would give enemies grounds for claiming that the country was being ruled by a Jew. So he really held that entire aspect as a part of his existence and knew that this was something that he could not come over or get over rather. His intellectualism, coupled with his aloof style and manner, gave him the appearance of an outsider who was not fully committed to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This deprived him of a significant following within the party. And this is linked to the fourth point also. We are just coming to that. Let's look at the third point for a minute. CPSU members tended to regard Trotsky as dangerously ambitious and his rival Stalin as reliably self-effacing. So Stalin came across as someone who was very self-effacing at this moment. He didn't like any limelight. He didn't like to be the center of the conversation. He liked to be the person in the corner. So that's a self-effacing style where you start, like very humbly declining things for yourself. So they found him reliably self-effacing, whereas dangerously ambitious was Trotsky. This was also because Trotsky was flamboyant and brilliant, while his rival was unspectacular and very methodical, like step by step. He was very interested in doing things like by the book. And finally, Trotsky had not become a Bolshevik until 1917, just before the October Revolution, which raised doubts about how committed he was to the party. Trotsky was in fact a Menshevik, and as a Menshevik also and within the Bolshevik party also, he had several times in public in recorded documents, he argued with Lenin, and that's something that will be used against him when the power struggle becomes even worse in the coming years. The new economic policy then, Trotsky's reputation was further damaged by the issue of the new economic policy. Soon after taking power, Lenin had in fact implemented a policy known as war communism. This was a series of harshly restrictive economic measures which intended to help the Bolsheviks win the civil war between 1918 and 20. So what were these very harsh measures? Some of them were, they brought industry and agriculture under central control, the government's control, in other words, the party's control. They used government requisition squads to seize grain stocks from peasants, so the government's needs were higher than those of the individual peasants. And finally, they prohibited farming for profit. So every profit, every ounce of extra money, surplus or surplus grain would go to the government. However, war communism obviously did not produce any spectacular or expected results. The interference with the peasants' traditional ways caused disruption and anger and resentment. Hunger, in fact, did not lessen, it only intensified. Despite the government's terror tactics, there were many instances of serious resistance. Always flexible in his approach, Lenin then decided to do a U-turn, so reverse war communism. He judged that if the peasants could not be forced, they must be persuaded. So at a party conference in 1921, he told the members that it made no sense for the Bolsheviks to pretend that they could pursue an economic policy which took no account of the real situation. So this entire idea that the real situation is of peasants who don't like us. So it's better to bring them into account and try and persuade them. He therefore announced that war communism was now to be replaced with something called a new economic policy, whose chief features were: number one, central economic control would be relaxed. So war communism, central economic control, both agriculture and industry. Reverse that, which means central economic control will be relaxed. Similarly, war communism, grain shall be requisited by force. There'll be people who will go and seize the grain. Grain requisition was completely abandoned. So reverse. And third, what was the point? The prohibition of farming for profit as a part of war communism. What would be the reverse of that? The peasants were now allowed to keep their food surpluses and sell them for a profit. So once you've given the government what the government has asked for, whatever is remaining, please sell it and make profit. We don't care about it. So in other words, the more you produce, the less you have to give to the government, the more you can sell for yourself. Alright, so production then of course that was the expectation, that the production would multiply. NEP clearly marked, so many reversals, so it clearly marked a retreat from the principle of state control of the economy, which is, by the way, at the very heart of Marxism. It restored a mixed economy in which certain features of capitalism existed alongside socialism. It was this that troubled members of the party, including Trotsky, who had welcomed the repressive measures of war communism. So Trotsky at heart was a Marxist in this sense, and he really wanted war communism to continue. To their mind, squeezing the peasants was exactly what the Bolsheviks should be doing, since it advanced the revolution. Because the peasant is just supposed to play a supporting role in the revolution. The revolution is mainly to take care of the proletariat, who shall be the ruling class. It disturbed them that the peasants were being cosseted and that capitalist ways were in fact being tolerated in the name of a new economic policy, which was in fact a mixed economy. So leftists and rightists, when introducing NEP in 1921, Lenin had admitted that it was a relaxing of strict socialism, but had emphasized that it was in fact a temporary measure. However, at the time of his death in 1924, the question was already being asked, how long can NEP continue? It had continued for 3 years. So serious Marxists were beginning to question, is this going to be the way in which Soviet Union is going to be run? That mixed economy is going to be acceptable? The party members who were unhappy with this saw its continuation as a betrayal of their original revolutionary principles. So therefore, a serious division had developed in the party between leftists and rightists. Initially, the disagreement was simply about the timing. How long is it going to go on? However, in the power struggle of the 1920s, these minor differences now deepened into questions of political correctness and party loyalty. A rival's attitude towards NEP might be a weakness to be exploited. Stalin did precisely this. He used this division, this minor division of how long and when, to in fact showcase and to essentialize opponents. In other words, if you're opposing this, you are opposing the entire movement. That is the kind of logic he is using. So if you are opposing this one clause, you are against the nation, you are against the party, you are against the government. So that is the kind of logic, that essentializing feature, which is so attractive to the public mind. That is something that he is using. Let's see what he does. He used Trotsky's attitude towards the NEP as a way of undermining him. Remember, Trotsky doesn't like NEP, he likes war communism. Trotsky in 1923 had openly declared that to continue NEP was to put the interests of the NEP men above those of the revolution. NEP men was this new class of, was this new class for profiteers who had in fact developed as a part of NEP. So all those farmers who were selling their extra produce for a profit, they had started coming up as and were being called NEP men, and it was in fact a derisive term. It was a term of verbal, I wouldn't say abuse, but it was a pejorative term. It was a negative term to call somebody NEP men. So in that's NEP, MEN, NEP, men. So NEP, New Economic Policy, men who have come out of New Economic Policy, NEP, men. So Trotsky had said that we are betraying the revolution for the profit of the or for the benefit of the NEP men above those of the revolution and to undermine the gains that were made by war communism. Now, Stalin was quick to suggest to party members that Trotsky was an unacceptably disruptive force. That NEP is going on, everything is going on in such a nice, smooth order. Why is he disrupting everything? The interesting point here is that Stalin's own view of NEP was far from clear at this stage. He didn't make clear that, what he thought of NEP, but he made sure that everybody knew that what Trotsky is thinking of NEP is absolutely wrong. That what Trotsky is, understanding in terms of NEP is a disruptive force. He had loyally supported Lenin's introduction of it in 1921, but had given little indication as to whether or how long it should be retained after Lenin's death. He preferred to keep his own views to himself and to play on the differences among party members. All right. He would, in these Politburo meetings, he would play the role of the person who was summing up the debate. So he would very rarely tell anyone what was his opinion. He would just try to, show himself as this middle candidate who agreed and who disagreed according to the voice of the room. So then this left and right division further moves over the question of modernization. The ideological argument over NEP merged with another demanding question: how should the Soviet Union plan for the future? The USSR was a poor country. To modernize it and to overcome its poverty it would have to industrialize. The quarrel in the party was not whether the USSR should industrialize, but the quarrel was how shall that be done and at what speed that shall be done. Now this is a quintessentially Marxist problem, because please understand, Marxism, the way he imagined it, Karl Marx imagined it, it was supposed to happen, the revolution was supposed to happen in an industrialized country, because the workers were supposed to be leading the revolution. Now here is a very technically problematic situation where the revolution has happened and now the question of industrialization is being discussed. Alright, so the larger question is then, in whose name did you do the revolution? To which of course there are no answers at this stage. The country was rich, the Soviet Union was rich in natural resources, but these had yet to be effectively exploited, and it certainly did not possess large amounts of capital. Nor could it easily borrow, because the Bolsheviks, after taking power, had in fact rejected the capitalist methods of finance and caused international outrage by refusing to honor any of the debts of the Tsarist state. Few countries after 1917 were willing to risk investing in revolutionary Russia. The only usable resource, therefore, was the Soviet people themselves, 80% of whom were in fact peasants. So there is no working class, there is no proletariat in whose name the revolution has happened. To achieve industrialization, it was necessary that the peasants produce a food surplus which could then be sold abroad to raise capital for industrial investment. That was the plan, that the peasants will grow the food, we will sell the food outside, whatever money comes will not be put back into farming, it will be put into industrialization. Both left and right agreed that this was the only solution. But whereas the right were only content to rely on persuading the peasants to cooperate, the left demanded, war communism was their favorite choice, so you would understand that they demanded that the peasants be forced to conform. So while the right is saying, well, it's okay, let's just persuade them, NEP, the left says, no, this is very important for the country, this is very important for the modernization of the country. The peasant, if he doesn't understand it, should be made to understand it, should be made to conform. It was Trotsky who most clearly represented the view of the left on this. He wanted the peasants to be coerced. However, for him, the industrialization debate was secondary to the far more demanding question of the Soviet Union's role in the organizer of the revolution. His views on this, of the international revolution, his views on this created a wide divergence between him and Stalin, expressed in terms of the clash between the opposed notions of a permanent revolution and socialism in one country. So, the permanent revolution is that at all times you are thinking of an international revolution. At all times. At all times you are thinking of, churning the revolution in a permanent stage. Socialism in one country means achieve it in one country and then we will look at the international part of it at a later stage. Now, it's very clear that Marx himself would have obviously thought of permanent revolution as the true condition, because Marx did not allow nationalism any space in his entire thinking and in his entire procedure. So socialism in one country is in fact, in simpler terms, in English terms, it's an oxymoron, because you cannot have the way socialism in, like Marx imagined socialism, in one country. Alright, because his socialism is international by its very existence. So Trotsky was an international Marxist. His central political belief at this time was in permanent revolution, a concept that made of three essential ideas. Number one, revolution is not a single event, it's a permanent event, continuous process. Number two, events in Russia since 1917 were merely the first step towards a permanent revolution. And number three, the USSR could not survive alone in a hostile world. It needed to export the revolution, and unless there was international revolution, the Soviet Union could not survive because it would at all times be besieged by and surrounded by enemies. So therefore, the international aspect of it was very important. Stalin countered Trotsky's notion of permanent revolution with his own concept of socialism in one country. He meant by this that the nation's first task was to consolidate Lenin's revolution, by turning the USSR into a modern state capable of defending itself against internal and external enemies. The Soviet Union's task, therefore, was to, number one, overcome its present agricultural and industrial problems by its own unaided efforts. Number two, proceed to build a modern state so that it can equal any state in the world. And number three, make the survival of the Soviet Union an absolute priority, even if this meant suspending the efforts right now to create an international revolution. So basically that can come secondarily. The nation, the socialism in one country, the building of the modern part of it is very important according to Joseph Stalin. Stalin used this contrast between his program and Trotsky's to portray his rival as an enemy of the Soviet Union. So he plays on exactly the same effort that Marx had in fact downplayed, which is the question of nationalism. So because you are opposing socialism in one country, well, you are opposing the Soviet Union. And that's the logic that he gives in order to compare. And he condemned Trotsky's ideas as a threat to the security of the USSR. Trotsky's position was further weakened by the fact that throughout the 1920s, the Soviet Union had a constant fear of invasion by the combined capitalist nations, which, by the way, the first onslaught of it, Trotsky was the one who got it defeated. The Whites as the first onslaught of all of this. Trotsky was the main leader of the Red Army when the Whites were defeated, and yet he's the one who's suffering when they have gone away, and the animosity is still continuing. Although this fear was ill-founded, the tense atmosphere it created made Trotsky's notion of USSR engaging in foreign revolutionary wars appear irresponsible. Why would you bother to fight these international wars when your own country is not in order, is the main question that people are asking him. So finally, no points for guessing what happens. There is a defeat of the left and there is a defeat of Trotsky. Trotsky's failure in the propaganda war of the 1920s meant that he was in no position to persuade either the Politburo or the Central Committee to support his proposals. Following a vote against him in the 1925 Party Congress, Trotsky was in fact removed from his position as the Commissar for War. So there was a Party Congress that took place, there was a vote that was taken, all of Stalin's henchmen are in place, all of his chosen people are in place, so obviously the vote goes against Trotsky. Kamenev and Zinoviev, the respective chairmen of the Moscow and Leningrad Soviets, played a key part in this. They used their influence, so apart from Stalin's influence, they used their influence, these two other leaders, over the local party organizations to ensure that it was a pro-Stalin and anti-Trotsky Congress that in fact had gathered. I don't want to give away the future, but Kamenev and Zinoviev will not come out of this very happy, of this kind of very pro-Stalinist support that they are doing in the 1920s, 1925. We shall see what happens to them. But anyway, let's come to the new opposition then. With Trotsky weakened, Stalin now turned to the problem of how to deal with two key figures that he saw as his potential, okay, it's right here, as his potential rivals, Kamenev and Zinoviev. So once Trotsky is out, he turns his attention to these two people who had in fact supported him in getting rid of Trotsky. In the event, this might read like a, 1960s Hollywood movie or like Italian mafia movie, but this is like history, okay? In the event, they created a trap for themselves. In 1925, worried by the USSR's slow economic growth, the two men called for the NEP to be abandoned. Concessions to peasants withdrawn, industrialization enforced. Their viewpoint now formed the basis of the term called new opposition. Alright, so the NEP being abandoned is the new opposition. Now what Trotsky did was separate, now there's a new opposition. But there was little to distinguish it from old Trotskyism. It was no surprise therefore when Trotsky joined his former opponents in 1926, it formed a Trotskyite, Kamenevite, Zinovievite opposition bloc. This is a very interesting part of history, how you name things in a certain way. Because later on then when you remember these things using memory, it's very easy then to distinguish. So everything that is non-Stalinist is the enemy. So you use these catchphrases, then Trotskyite becomes a way of abuse. It becomes a derisive term, pardon me. And similarly Kamenev or Zinovievite, it also becomes these terms, alright. So again, Stalin's control of the party machine proved decisive. The party Congress declined to be influenced by the pressure from the new opposition. The right communists backed Stalin and outvoted the left bloc altogether this time. Kamenev and Zinoviev were both dismissed from their posts as Soviet chairmen to be replaced by two of Stalin's staunchest allies, Vyacheslav Molotov in Moscow and Sergei Kirov in Leningrad. Kirov, of course, will come back very soon. Molotov lives on for quite a long time. In fact, he is the person who signs the Nazi-Soviet pact in the 1940s on behalf of the Soviet Union as the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. Molotov signs that pact, and on the side of the Nazi Germany, Ribbentrop signs that pact. So another name for the Nazi-Soviet pact is in fact the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact as well. It was little surprise that soon after Trotsky was expelled from both the Politburo and the Central Committee. So this is the very end of Leon Trotsky as far as his understanding of this entire party is concerned. Mind you, he has only been expelled from the top bodies of the party. He has not been expelled from the party itself. He is very much still a member of the party. So this then goes on to the question of bureaucratization. Obviously, Trotsky was not very happy because he is the Commissar of War and he's a very smart, intellectual guy who has managed to achieve quite a lot of things for the Soviet Union. So just throwing him out without, one has to expect some sort of, fighting back from him, and he does that. He does attempt to fight back. This issue, that issue over which the fighting will happen, is the question of bureaucratization. He defined this as the abandonment of genuine discussion within the party and the growth of the power of the secretariat, which was able to make decisions and operate policies without reference to the ordinary party members. So he says that why aren't the ordinary party members being asked? Why is everything being done by the officials? Obviously, the head of the secretariat is Joseph Stalin. So by questioning the officials, he is actually trying to question Joseph Stalin, who sits at the top of the entire pyramid of bureaucracy. Trotsky called for a greater party democracy to fight this growth, but his campaign was misjudged. In trying to expose the growing bureaucracy in the Communist Party, Trotsky overlooked the essential fact that the Bolshevik rule since 1917 had in fact always been bureaucratic. When was the last time that the party ever heard the democratic members of the party, like the 600,000 people that are a part of the Communist Party of Soviet Union? Never. So this is quite a late realization that he has. Indeed, it was because the Soviet state functioned as a bureaucracy that party members received the privileges in political and public life. So when he's trying to question those positions in the bureaucracy, he's actually trying to question their privileges, and that was clearly not acceptable. Trotsky gained little support from the party members who had vested interests in maintaining the party's bureaucratic ways. His censure of bureaucracy, in fact, left Stalin unscathed, untouched. And this, of course, leads to then Trotsky's expulsion. Trotsky still did not admit defeat. In 1927, on the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Rising, he tried to rally support in direct challenge to Stalin's authority. He was again heavily outvoted. His complete failure led to Congress accepting Stalin's proposal that Trotsky be expelled from the party altogether because he is disturbing us too many times. He has already been thrown out of the Politburo and the Central Committee, yet he keeps presenting these challenges in order to thwart the party. In fact, so much so he's gone against the ordinary party members. So therefore, it's time that we in fact throw him out of the party altogether. An internal exile order against him in 1927 was followed 2 years later by deportation from the USSR itself, the country that he had literally fought as the commanding officer of the Red Army to save from the Whites. Well, that was the country that has now chosen to throw him out of the territory of the country altogether. He is deported from the USSR. That Trotsky was not executed at this point suggests that Stalin yet did not regard himself as being fully in control. So later on, not all opponents would meet such an easy exit. Alright, the kind of exit that Trotsky had. Later on, if you were in such bad books with Joseph Stalin, there was no way that you would not be executed. So that's the kind of future that would meet some of the later leaders. As far as he's concerned, he manages to escape, but there's no end of the world that you can escape as far as Joseph Stalin is concerned. To give away the story, Trotsky is in fact murdered on Stalin's orders in South America. So, pardon me, in Mexico. So there's a pitch axe that is attacked. He's attacked with a pitch axe and he's ice knife, I think, or pitch axe. I'll have to get back to you on that. But then he is in fact attacked and he is killed on Stalin's orders later in life. So that is the end of Leon Trotsky and his entire adventures within the Soviet Union. We do have to start another bit on the defeat of the right opposition, because obviously now that the left opposition has been taken care of, Kamenev and Zinoviev thrown out of their Soviet chairmanships and Leon Trotsky completely expelled from the party, clearly there are others now, the same people who united with Joseph Stalin on the right in order to throw out the left. Stalin is of course not going to forgive them for showing any loyalty to him. So there was a standard joke at this point of time, especially in the 1930s. In Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union, one never grew old. One was always young. And the point is not that you were always ageless and young. The point is that you were executed so early that you would never live to enjoy the old age. On that note, let's stop this video. On that not so encouraging note, let's stop this video. I'm looking forward to discussing the defeat of the right opposition with you in the next video. Till then, Thank you so much.